Every Christmas morning Thomas woke before sunrise and quietly walked into his living room outside the small village. Everything was covered in white snow and the streets were completely silent. Thomas slowly walked toward his Christmas tree and looked beneath its branches. As he did every year, there were always 3 presents beneath that tree, and one of them was never opened. 2 presents carried names written carefully across their wrapping paper, while the third had nothing written on it. It was always wrapped in silver paper with an old red ribbon tied around it. Thomas had bought that same present every Christmas for 15 long years without missing a single year. His daughter Sophie had always wondered who it was meant for, but Thomas never gave her an answer. Whenever she asked him about it, Thomas simply smiled and quietly told her the same thing: someone who has not come home yet. Sophie never understood what those words meant, but she knew her father's voice always changed whenever Christmas arrived. Thomas was 74 years old and had lived alone since his wife Margaret passed away. His daughter lived several hours away but always returned home for Christmas to spend time with him. That year Sophie arrived earlier than usual and immediately noticed the silver present beneath the tree. She looked at it for several seconds before finally asking the question she had carried for years: "Dad, who is that present really for?" Thomas stopped wrapping another gift and slowly looked toward the Christmas tree. For a moment he said nothing and then quietly answered, "Someone I promised never to forget." Sophie sat beside him and studied his tired face because she could see there was something painful behind those words. "Who is that someone, Dad?" Thomas looked toward the window where snow had begun falling again outside. Then he walked toward an old wooden cabinet that had belonged to his wife. He opened the bottom drawer and removed a small photograph covered in dust and faded with age. He placed it carefully into Sophie's hands without saying anything. The photograph showed a much younger Thomas standing beside a little boy at an old railway station. The boy wore a blue winter coat and held a small Christmas card tightly against his chest. Sophie turned the photograph over and noticed several handwritten words across the back: "Christmas Eve, I made a promise." She looked at her father with confusion and asked, "Who is this little boy?" Thomas took a slow breath before finally answering. "His name was Daniel. I met him 15 years ago on Christmas Eve. He was only 7 years old when I found him sitting alone at the railway station." Sophie looked at the photograph again and noticed the sadness in the boy's eyes. "Why was he alone at the station?" Thomas looked down at the floor and his voice became almost a whisper. "Because he was waiting for someone who promised they would come, but that person never arrived." Sophie felt a strange chill move through her heart as she looked back at the silver present. Suddenly she understood that this was not simply a Christmas tradition for her father. It was something connected to a promise he had carried alone for 15 years. Thomas looked at his daughter and quietly said, "There is something else you need to know." Sophie waited silently as her father reached for another old envelope hidden inside the drawer, and what was written inside that envelope would finally reveal why Thomas had never stopped buying that mysterious Christmas gift. Thomas slowly opened the old envelope and removed a small Christmas card that looked almost as old as the photograph. Sophie watched her father unfold the card and noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. Inside the card were only a few simple words written by a child many years ago: "Dear Thomas, I will come back next Christmas, I promise." Sophie looked at her father and suddenly understood why the silver present had remained beneath the tree for so many years. Daniel had written those words -1 years earlier, after Thomas found him alone at the railway station. It had been Christmas Eve and the station was almost empty when Thomas noticed the little boy sitting alone on a wooden bench. Daniel was wearing a thin blue coat and holding a small paper bag against his chest as though it contained something precious. Thomas walked toward him and gently asked where his parents were and why he was sitting there. Alaneath boy looked toward the station entrance and quietly said, "Me father is coming," he promised. Mathemas sat beside him and waited because something about the boy made him feel he should not leave. Minutes passed and the station slowly became quieter as the final trains departed into the snowy night. Daniel continued watching the entrance with complete confidence because he believed his father would keep his promise, but no one came. Thomas eventually contacted the station manager and the local police, but nobody knew where the boy's father was. While they waited, Thomas noticed the Christmas card in Daniel's hands and asked him who it was for. Daniel smiled sadly and said, "He made it for my dad because I wanted to give him something special." Thomas felt something break inside him because he knew the boy was waiting for more. Then a train was waiting for his father to return. Later that night, the police finally discovered what had happened to Daniel's father. Had been driving toward the station when his car crashed on an icy road, had died before reaching the station. Daniel was too young to understand the truth completely and kept asking Thomas when his father would arrive. Thomas stayed beside him until the authorities found Daniel's aunt, who agreed to take him home. For Daniel left the station, he gave Thomas the Christmas card he had made for his father. "Please keep it," Daniel whispered, "because I want someone to remember him." Thomas promised he would never forget Daniel or the promise that little boy believed his father had made. The following Christmas, Thomas bought a small present and placed it beneath his tree because he believed Daniel might return someday, but Daniel never came. The next Christmas, Thomas bought another present and then another. The year after that, 15 years passed, but Thomas never stopped waiting. Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek and looked at the silver present again. "Dad," she whispered, "what happened to Daniel?" After that night, Thomas looked toward the window and remained silent for several seconds. Then he quietly said, "He searched for him for years, but I never found him." Sophie looked confused because something about her father's words did not make sense. "If you never found him, then why are you still buying the present?" Thomas looked directly into her eyes and gave her an answer she would never forget, "because I made another promise that night, and this time the promise was to Daniel himself." Sophie looked at her father and waited for him to explain the promise he had made all those years ago. Thomas slowly looked toward the silver present beneath the Christmas tree. He promised Daniel that if his father never came back, then someone would still remember him every Christmas. Sophie felt tears filling her eyes. "But Dad, you have remembered him for 15 years. Thomas smiled sad lies, "but I never knew if you remembered me." For the next few days, Sophie could not stop thinking about Daniel. She kept looking at the old photograph and wondering what had happened to the little boy. After that Christmas Eve, finally she asked her father if he still had any information about Daniel. Thomas walked to the old cabinet and opened another drawer. Inside was a small notebook filled with names, addresses, and a test. Sophie looked through the pages until she found Daniel's name. Beside his name, Thomas had written several old addresses. Every one of them had been crossed out. Sophie looked at her father. "You really searched for him?" Thomas nodded. "Daddy searched everywhere I could. He wrote letters, I contacted people from the station, and even visited the town where his aunt lived, but every trail eventually disappeared." Sophie carefully turned another page and noticed something Thomas had never mentioned, that there was one final address written at the bottom of the page, and unlike the others, it had never been crossed out. "Dad, what is this?" Plessy Thomas looked at the address and became completely silent. "You do not know. We found it many years ago, but I was afraid to go there." "We were you afraid?" Thomas looked down at the old notebook. "Because sometimes you spend so many years hoping for something that you become afraid of discovering the truth." Sophie reached for his hand. "Then let us find out together." The following morning, Thomas and Sophie drove toward the address. It was several hours away, in a quiet little town surrounded by green fields and narrow country roads. When they finally arrived, they found an old brick house standing beside a small church. Thomas remained inside the car for several minutes. He stared at the house without moving. After 15 years, he finally had a chance to discover whether Daniel was still there. Sophie gently touched his shoulder. "Dad, whatever happened, we will face it together." Thomas took a deep breath and slowly stepped out of the car. He walked toward the front door. Thomas raised his hand and knocked. Nothing happened. Then he knocked again. After a few seconds, the door finally opened. A young man stood there, looked to be in his early 20s. Thomas looked at him carefully. There was something familiar about his physique. The young man stared at Thomas for several seconds before his eyes suddenly moved toward the old photograph in Thomas' hand, where did you get that? He asked. Thomas felt his heart stop, slowly held the photograph toward the young man. Have been looking for someone named Daniel. The young man looked at the photograph again, then he quietly stepped backward. Me. Named as Danielle. Thomas could not speak. 15 years of waiting suddenly disappeared in one single moment. He covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Danielle looked at Thomas with confusion and slowly asked, "Are you the man from the railway station?" Thomas nodded as tears filled his eyes. "Daniele, I am the man who waited with you." Danielle stared at him for several seconds, then he smiled through his tears. "He thought you were gone forever." Thomas looked at him and whispered, "Eddie thought you were gone forever too." Neither of them knew what to say next, but both understood that the 15-year wait had finally come to an end. Thomas stood completely still as he looked at the young man standing in the doorway. For 15 years he had imagined this moment, but never believed it would actually happen. Daniel looked at him carefully as though searching through an old memory buried somewhere inside his mind. Then his eyes moved toward the silver present Thomas was holding against his chest. "You remember that ribbon?" Daniel whispered. "Because my father used to wrap my presents that way." Thomas felt tears slowly running down his face, and Sophie quietly stepped closer beside him. Daniel opened the door wider and invited them inside without saying anything more. The house was warm and simple, with photographs hanging along the walls and a small Christmas tree near the window. Daniel looked at Thomas again and asked, "Why did you come here after all these years?" Thomas placed the silver present carefully on the table and slowly answered, "Because I made you a promise." Daniel looked confused until Thomas removed the old Christmas card from his pocket and placed it beside the present. Daniel immediately recognized the handwriting and picked up the card with trembling hands. "He thought this was lost forever," he whispered while staring at the words he had written as a child. Thomas smiled through his tears and told him that he had kept it every Christmas since that night. Daniel slowly sat down and covered his face with his hands. "For years I thought nobody remembered me," he said quietly. Thomas sat beside him and answered, "He never forgot you." Daniel began crying as memories from that Christmas Eve slowly returned to him. He remembered the railway station, the freezing night, and the kind man who had stayed beside him. But there was one memory he had forgotten completely: a life promise Thomas had made before Daniel left that night. "He told you I would wait for you," he said. Thomas smiled and replied, "He waited every Christmas." Daniel looked at the silver present and slowly pushed it back toward Thomas. "You should open it," he said. Thomas shook his head and smiled. "No, Daniel, this was always meant for you." Daniel carefully removed the silver wrapping paper and slowly opened the present. Inside was a simple wooden train beautifully carved by hand. Daniel stared at it with tears filling his eyes. "Me father gave me one just like this when I was little," he whispered. Thomas had never known that detail, but somehow he had chosen the right gift. Daniel held the wooden train close to his chest just as he had held the Christmas card 15 years earlier. Then he looked at Thomas and asked, "Did you keep doing this every year?" Thomas looked toward the window and quietly answered, "Because I knew you might still be waiting." Daniel wiped his tears and smiled. "For the first time I was waiting," he said, "but I never knew who I was waiting for." Thomas reached across the table and gently held his hand. "You were waiting for someone to remember you." Daniel looked down at their hands and began crying again. That Christmas evening, Thomas stayed with Daniel until late at night while Sophie watched them talking and laughing together. For the first time she understood why her father had never stopped buying that mysterious present. It had never been about the gift, it had always been about keeping a promise. Before Thomas left that night, Daniel stood beside the doorway holding the wooden train. Thomas turned around and looked at him one final time. Daniel smiled and said something Thomas had waited 15 years to hear. "You do not have to wait anymore, Thomas. I am here now." The next morning Thomas woke with a feeling he had not felt in 15 years. For the first time, Christmas did not feel like a day of waiting. It felt like a day of finally finding what he had lost. Thomas and Sophie prepared to return home, but Daniel stood outside the house holding the wooden train. Before Thomas left, Daniel walked toward him and quietly handed him another small package. Thomas looked surprised and asked, "What is this?" Daniel smiled and told him to open it. When he reached home. During the journey back, Thomas kept looking at the package, wondering what Daniel had placed inside. When they finally reached the village, Sophie helped her father sit beside the Christmas tree. Thomas carefully opened Daniel's package and found a small wooden Christmas ornament. On the ornament were two names, Thomas and Daniel. Thomas stared at it for several seconds before tears filled his eyes. There was also a small handwritten note attached to the back. "Thank you for remembering me." Thomas held the note against his heart and quietly closed his eyes. Sophie sat beside him and gently placed her hand over his dad. She whispered, "You finally found him." Thomas smiled and looked toward the empty space beneath the Christmas tree. For 15 years there had always been 3 presents beneath that tree, one for Sophie, one for Thomas, and one for someone who never came. But this Christmas something was different. Thomas placed the silver wrapping paper aside and looked at the empty space beneath the tree. There would be no third present next Christmas because there was no longer anyone missing. A few days later, Daniel came to visit Thomas and brought something that made him smile. It was an old photograph of Daniel as a little boy sitting at the railway station, but this time Daniel had written something on the back: "I was never forgotten." Thomas read those words again and again before placing the photograph beside the Christmas tree. Years passed and Daniel became part of Thomas and Sophie's family. Every Christmas they gathered together around the same tree, but Thomas never forgot the first Christmas when he had waited for Daniel. He understood something that he had never understood before. Sometimes people do not need expensive gifts. Sometimes they only need to know that somebody remembers them. Thomas had spent 15 Christmases buying a present for someone who was not coming, but in the end he discovered that the person he was waiting for had been searching for the same thing, a place where he still belonged. And that Christmas Thomas finally gave Daniel something much more valuable than any present. He gave him a family that remembered his name, a home where he would always be welcome, and a promise that would never be broken again. From that Christmas onward, there were only 2 presents beneath Thomas' Christmas tree, one for Sophie and one for Daniel, because the greatest Christmas gift was never the present Thomas had wrapped. It was the person who finally came home.